High on the list of adult things I don't fully understand is this.
The annual inflation rate accelerates to 7.5%.
Inflation is rising at its fastest rate in 40 years.
Consumers are suffering the effects of higher inflation.
I know that my favorite Trader Joe's snack recently jumped from $1.99 to $2.29, and that a 3% cost of living adjustment would be equivalent to a pay cut. But if I try to follow the thread much further than that, like what interest rates have to do with this, or how the Federal Reserve waves its magic money wand in times of crisis, it all just gets too confusing. But it's time I learn, because we appear to be entering the first period of prolonged inflation that people around my age will experience as working adults. And I'm going to explain what I learned with candy. Partly because it's fun, and partly because today's inflation is sort of uniquely frightening in some ways. A spoonful of sugar helps the convoluted economic analysis of our shared financial future go down. Right? Let's start with the what. Inflation is a general rise in prices across the whole economy. Because everything is more expensive, your money doesn't buy as much as it used to. Inflation is not a spike in prices for a particular good. Let's say that peanut butter cups suddenly become super trendy and everyone is clamoring to get them. Or say a tropical disease wipes out half the world's cocoa trees, making chocolate more expensive to acquire. In each case, retailers and manufacturers would raise their prices, meaning our money would buy fewer peanut butter cups. But the impact of that stops with the peanut butter cups. Their price is inflated, but that's not inflation. When prices rise generally across the whole economy, the relative value of our money drops for everything. That's inflation. And why that happens is the next part of this complicated story. Here, dear viewer, we have to venture into the land of simplification. Because I found in interviewing a professor of economics that explaining every part of this phenomenon perfectly accurately is basically impossible for one video.
Come and get an MBA at the NYU Stern School of Business, Karen. Sorry.
I might have to before I can ever finish this video. See the description box below for all the pedantic nuance you could ever want on this topic. Anyway, the first thing to know is that a little bit of inflation is often considered a good thing. It can be a sign of a healthy economy, businesses expanding, people buying stuff, etc. The Federal Reserve, which is America's central bank that's partly in charge of managing inflation, aims for an average inflation rate of about 2% annually. But when it gets too high, consumers can't keep up. Think of how your grocery or energy bill have spiked recently. Why it can get too high is a lot more complicated in today's economy than it used to be. Back when money was tied to a certain amount of gold, a sudden spike in the supply of gold induced inflation, like when the Spanish raided Americas and flooded Europe with gold. Now it's way more common and thus less valuable. There are a lot of other factors involved, but that was a big one. But today, the gold standard is done, and the economy is a lot more complicated than it was back then. So a variety of phenomena can induce inflation. Here are a few. Similar to gold back then is oil today, a crucial raw material for the entire economy. Oil greases the wheels of the entire global economy, so price hikes for oil often lead to price hikes for everything else. Back to the peanut butter cups. If the peanuts and cacao are sourced from one place, transported to another for production, then many more places for retail, each of those steps requires oil. So if the price of oil spikes due to embargoes or political instability in producing regions, those higher prices trickle out to the rest of the economy. Now multiply that by every single good in the economy and you can see the issue. Next is wars. Inflation basically goes hand in hand with war, both during and after. Take World War II. During the war, civilians were unable to buy tons of products due to rationing. The end of the war meant consumers on the home front and returning soldiers were itching to buy all the consumer luxuries they couldn't have during the war. But the economy struggled to switch from war mode back to consumer mode. So as millions of people clamored to buy the latest refrigerators and cars, manufacturers took a while to catch up to the surge of demand. It's like steering a big ship. It takes a while for the economy to... Finally, even human expectations can drive inflation. If we all start anticipating higher prices, we will lobby for raises. Across the whole economy, businesses will pass those extra costs on to us, thus undercutting the value of the raises we just got. All that leaves the economy in a bit of a pickle. Dealing with that pickle is the responsibility of the federal government, which we'll get to a little bit later. But today's pickle is a bit different than pickles past. Inflation today is tricky for a few reasons. First, because of how it started. A near total shutdown of non-essential services, followed by a snarling of supply chains for goods.
The long-run trend of American consumption, which for 40 years had been favoring more services, had switched during the early days of the pandemic. They switched their demand to goods.
With services like movies, salons, restaurants, tourism, etc. shut down either by government mandate or reluctance to mingle with others, that spending fell. Spending on goods also fell, but not as much. So it's early in the pandemic, and the government is worried that all this not spending is going to tank the economy. Enter the second reason today's inflation is unique: a massive infusion of money into consumers' pockets in the form of repeat relief checks.
At just the time when people are switching over to goods, at just the time when the supply of goods has become a problem.
You've definitely heard of this, the supply chain crisis. Let's say that people really want to buy Skittles, but Skittle manufacturers are struggling to get the raw materials and the workers necessary to make them, thanks to COVID restrictions, not to mention getting them to retailers.
That is a recipe for higher prices.
So Skittles get more expensive. For legal reasons, this is just an illustrative example. I can't speak to the state of the actual Skittles supply line, okay?
So a lot of people, and if somebody had asked me, they didn't, but if they had asked me at the time, and certainly people in the Biden administration and at the Federal Reserve were saying, look, this is a transition. The port is going to get unstuck. The trucking companies are going to figure out their logistics issues. People are going to get vaccinated. They're going to start wanting to consume services again. This is a transitory thing. Within a couple of months, it should be cleared up.
But that didn't happen. Getting supply chains unclogged remained difficult in the face of worker shortages and ongoing COVID waves. So many goods remain hard to get to this day. So what can you expect next? The most common response to inflation is one you've probably heard a lot about recently.
This morning, a major change.
Confirming that the central bank will, in fact, hike interest rates.
As expected, the Fed raising rates by a quarter point.
The Federal Reserve is the central bank for the United States. Think of it like a bank for banks, supplying them loans that they pass on to us in the form of business loans, credit cards, and indirectly, mortgages. And no, it doesn't actually have a magic money wand, sadly. What the Fed typically does in times of high inflation is raise interest rates for banks looking to borrow money. This makes the banks less willing to borrow that money because it's more expensive for them, and they'll pass those extra expenses on to us in the form of higher interest rates for our loans. It's basically a way to cool off an overheated economy.
There's a recognition that certainly in this inflationary environment, interest rates do need to increase. The worry is they go up too far, too fast, and suddenly we are in a recession again. We're not going to see a sharp increase that could, send us skittering into a recession. But some moderate increase, everybody knows that.
On Wednesday, March 16th, the Fed raised interest rates by 0.25%, with more raises expected to come later this year. So what does this mean for you? Well, we could be in for a rough few years. Raised interest rates often cause a spike in unemployment as businesses scrap projects or plans to expand. Additionally, inflation won't disappear overnight. As it carries on, any savings you have will become less and less valuable, even as your expenses become more and more expensive. As for the longer-term future, it's hard to say. Hi. I finished writing this video at the end of February, the same day this happened.
The world is on edge as Russia launches a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is following months of threatening moves. Ukrainians and other people across the region are now living in absolute fear amid growing questions about the country's future.
Obviously, the ramifications of this situation extend far beyond American economic woes. But I need to mention it because, like I said before, wars often spark inflation, especially when that war takes place in a key region for the production of oil. Because this is a rapidly evolving situation, talk of how it could affect inflation is, at this point, educated guesswork. It's unclear what, if anything, the Federal Reserve will do differently in light of this situation, but you can check the description box below for the latest updates.